So this will be a kind of a quick overview of life during the Great Depression. I'll share kind of in a different link the interviews with the survivors of the Great Depression. Really kind of good little 10-minute segment that kind of has actual interviews with people recalling their life during the Great Depression. We don't have to spend too much time on this. Just know that by 1933, you have a bunch of banks failing, you have a lot of companies out of business, and the big number is that you have 25% unemployed. That average family income has fallen almost in half, right? $1,600, $1,500 a month. And it's making it really hard. Remember, a lot of these people had borrowed money to buy houses and cars and radios and that kind of stuff. So the Depression is hitting everyone by 1933. Of course, part of it, and we'll talk about this when we get to FDR, he wins the election in 32. And between the November 32 and when he takes the oath of office in March, because at this point the inauguration is still happening in March, that you have a series of bank panics that actually makes the economy even worse than it was going into November of 32. And it was pretty bad then. You have lots of soup kitchens, bread lines, coffee and donut lines, that kind of thing. People losing their homes, children losing educational opportunities. And you also have a lot of men leaving their families, or young men that decide they're going to strike out on their own, that either because they don't want to see their family suffer, because they don't want to be a burden to their family, sometimes because it's easier to take care of yourself and not have to take care of a family. A lot of times the perception was it was more acceptable for women and children to accept charity and to go to bread lines and that kind of thing. It was less acceptable for men. So you begin to create what is called the hobo culture. These guys that travel around, looking, asking for food, kind of begging, that sort of thing. And of course, the question with all these people being unemployed, with all this kind of disruption in American society, how are we supposed to help these people without damaging their character? And how do we protect individualism? How do we protect hope that you can work hard and pull yourself up when you have 25% unemployment and people losing their homes and people going hungry? What does that look like, right? So this is the big, huge question. And a lot of people really see the Great Depression as the failure of capitalism, right? That capitalism kind of imploded on itself. And of course, it's all made worse by the Dust Bowl. We talked about the overproduction, and I've mentioned briefly that in World War I, they're saying, "Oh, feed the world, go use a tractor and get fertilizer and overplant." And as the prices fall, once Europe recovers and the tariffs are high, and the farmers will continue to overproduce, trying to make up the difference in the price, right? 50 years of overproduction, really, going back to the 1870s, 1880s, all the way into the 1930s, have crucially damaged the topsoil. So this is where kind of that Homestead Act and the price fluctuations, where this kind of comes back and bites us in the butt. And so you have in the Great Plains, a much drier than normal season creates a drought. You have damaged topsoil. And so then you have these massive dust storms, right, that blow in, cover everything, seep into the house. People get dust pneumonia. Animals die from inhaling dust. And so it really begins to create some problems. And so when these farmers can't make their taxes, when they can't make their loan payments, they end up having to pack up and move off, right? A lot of them will move to the cities looking for work. Some of them will move to California, out to the west, looking for, because California is not affected by the Dust Bowl. And California actually has a thriving agricultural sector. So a lot of these people will pack up and move. These are typically, the slang term is they're Okies. Because many of them come from Oklahoma, but certainly not all Okies were from Oklahoma. The gist of it is that these people from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, South and North Dakota that packed up everything they had to move out west or move into the city were known as migrant farmers or Okies, or kind of refugees, if you will. And so you have even more unemployed and hungry and that kind of thing. So you can see this picture, next time take the train, and you've got two guys that are, hobos, basically, children, living out of your car. Lots of people were doing that as they were moving around. Lots of internal migration tents. Really, the disruption for children is really horrific to me. Like I said, that'll really break your heart. You have, again, the Dust Bowl is caused by overproduction, encouraged by technology, encouraged by the government, and then made worse by drought. And many Americans, of course, deal with unemployment, homelessness, hunger. And American culture will kind of respond. First off, you'll have the golden age of cinema. By the time you get to the end of the 1920s, movies have sound, right? Talking pictures. And so the 30s is known as the golden age. Movies were made pretty cheaply back then. So unless you were just really destitute, if you had any kind of source of income, you would try to save up the nickel or the quarter or whatever it costs to go to the movies. And so you do have people going to the movies if they have any kind of employment. You had lots of people with radios because of the 1920s. They'd purchased a lot of those. So this allows for the soap operas and the comedy routines and that kind of thing. Steinbeck writes his Grapes of Wrath, if you've ever read that. And you've got, interestingly, a lot of photojournalists, journalists, artists actually document life as it really is. So while radio and cinema kind of offer an escape from the frustration and the disappointment of the Great Depression, photography and journalism provide kind of a real, actual picture of what's happening, right? And so you've got kind of a variety of things happening with American culture. Now, it's into this in 1932 that you have FDR come into being. FDR, of course, is a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He, works his way up from New York, becomes a New York senator, is assistant secretary of the Navy during World War I. He is the vice presidential nominee in 1920. Of course, the Democrats lose in 1920 to Warren G. Harding. But then he will get polio in 1921 and will be paralyzed, and maybe not paralyzed. He'll be his lower half will be damaged. His nerves will be so damaged that he can't walk. Right, so he will have to spend the rest of his life either in a wheelchair or being aided with these really tight braces. And so he will learn to be able to stand and kind of walk in kind of sort of way, but it'll be very difficult. Most of the time he'll actually be in a wheelchair. So he will get polio, but he'll come back from that and become governor of New York in 1928. So when the Great Depression happens, he is going to basically, as the New York governor, is going to have a really robust and active state government that provides direct relief to people. So when he starts running for president in 1932, it's very clear that he's going to advocate for a much more direct relief, heavy government involvement kind of approach, because that's what he had done as a New York governor. And so he promises over and over again a new deal. I promise a new deal for the American people. And he, it will win the 1932 election, and pledges himself, we're going to do something about this. We're going to make a difference. So there's so much optimism, and we'll look at his first inaugural address and kind of talk about the hope and the optimism in that particular speech. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of really changes the tone. People for the first time since 1930 have a sense of hope that maybe we're going to be able to turn things around. Won't be as easy as all that, but you'll certainly have him approaching things from a very experimental, let's look at the results. We want to try this. And if it gets results, great. If it doesn't get results, we'll do something else. Very progressive agenda. So this is progressivism back at it, right? Kind of side note, he is married to Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor. So Eleanor, his wife, and Franklin were distant cousins. They weren't close enough that they, had to worry about any kind of genetic issues, but they were, did have the same last name. So always kind of a little interesting tidbit. Eleanor Roosevelt is a new type of first lady, very actively concerned with with minorities, well, with immigrants too, but African Americans, women, anybody of color. So she's a huge advocate for those people. and she will absolutely be FDR's leg. So FDR, whose mobility is limited, will rely on Eleanor to travel around the country and kind of take his message to the people and report back to him what she sees happening around the country. So she's going to be a very active, engaged First Lady, very much a partner to FDR. Their marriage in and of itself was kind of interesting. This is your TMZ moment for history. He was a player, actually. Yes, he had been affected by polio and could not walk, but he was not totally paralyzed. And so he had a tendency to like the ladies, had several affairs, a couple of them long-term affairs. Eleanor Roosevelt finds out about this going into, I believe, the 1920 election, and they choose to stay married. And essentially, she kind of ignores the affairs, and they really kind of develop a relationship that's based on politics, that's based on mutual goals, that kind of thing. And the children that they've had together, they have like 6 kids or something. So you do have a unique kind of political marriage. A lot of people kind of compare the Clintons to the Roosevelts. I don't know that that's exactly an apples to apples comparison, but it is a political marriage, and she is a new type of First Lady. She is crucial to his political success, but that in no way, I mean, the fact that he had affairs and the fact that he was in a wheelchair really only points to the different way that media treated presidents back then, where people didn't dig into that kind of stuff. They didn't make a bunch of noise. The news journalists knew he was in a wheelchair. They just tended to not photograph it. So you have a very different kind of relationship. FDR was good with the press, had a great relationship with them, was very politically savvy. And so, you have this type of president, and he will be elected 4 different times. He will die in office after the 4th election, but he will be, an incredibly popular president and an incredibly strong president, but not a perfect president by any stretch of the imagination. And even his New Deal, for all that it promotes dramatic change in American society and in the American economy, it certainly does not solve the Great Depression in and of itself. It will take World War II to solve the Great Depression. So I'll stop this here. Like I said, there will be some other videos that kind of go into the Dust Bowl and some of that stuff. So hopefully that will help you kind of get a snapshot of what that's like.